All right, so for this walkthrough, we are going to be building a custom property editor for an action called Send Rich Email. Send Rich Email is available in unofficial SF, and it basically extends the basic email sending that's in Flow with a lot of useful email features. And because it's got so many features, it's got a relatively, I mean, look at all this documentation. It's got a relatively complex property editor. So let's take a look at that. So if I drag the existing version out, you can see that it's got a huge number of things that you can set in the property editor. These input values, sometimes we call them parameters, sometimes we call them attributes or properties. But basically, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. The more features and power that get added to one of these actions, the more complicated this is. And this is perhaps the most complicated invocable action that's ever been built for real use. And it's built, one of the reasons why it's built this way is that because the basic property editor can only do this one thing, this text field, uh, there are certain things we want to do that just are limited. So let me show you what the end product looks like. Okay, so let's take a look at the end product. The end product, this is the same action. You can see that in between the header, which is still handled by Flow, and the advanced manual assignment, there is this much more appealing interface with all sorts of goodies, embedded components, conditional field activities, uh, but still the ability to add in upstream merge fields. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a project that has in it the invocable action for send rich email. So I'm going to go to VS Code and I'm going to say create project, and we will call this the send rich email CPE walkthrough, and I will place this in my development folder. And to add in the existing action, I will create an Apex class and call this. Now I'm going to copy in the existing class, so I want to get the name right or I'll have some headaches. So let's go over to the existing class, which I am simply going to copy and paste. All right, so let's go get the Apex class. It's right here. It's called Send Rich Email. It's got all the functionality. This is great. And I am simply going to take it and I am going to go here and I'm going to add it here into my new project. And because CPEs are Spring 20, I'm going to look here to make sure that it's got the Spring 20 version number. So far, so good. Let's now add the test class. Okay, so I've saved these, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my Scratch org where I'm going to test out all of my work. So a good first test of this is going to be to push this class up there and make sure that it works. Create a simple flow, send a simple email. So I need a Scratch org. I don't have a Scratch org set for this, and The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to authorize my dev hub because I use a variety of dev hubs, and in this case I am going to use a Spring 20 dev hub, which is going to give me those Spring 20 scratch orgs. If I didn't do that, then I'd end up with scratch orgs that wouldn't understand this pre-release stuff, but that's not going to be an issue. By the time you're watching this, Spring 20 will probably be well in the rearview mirror. Okay, so this is just one of my sort of pre-release dev hubs. I go back here. The dev hub is authorized, so now I can create a scratch org. And I'm going to call this, let's see, CPE Walk 1. So while we're creating the scratch org, let's talk about how we are going to connect this Apex class, this invocable action, to our new LWC. The linkage is done by adding a configuration editor attribute to this invocable method. So we'll do that in a minute, but since we have now successfully created our scratch org, let's now push these two Apex classes up to that scratch org and then open it up and test it out. It didn't take long to push because it's a pretty small thing. Let's open it up, and you can see while this is opening, you can see that VS Code is now tracking. We have associated this particular scratch org is the active scratch org for this new project that we've created. All right, and so if we go look in Developer Console on this org, this scratch org, we can go here and see that the classes have shown up. So far so good. And now let's create our first demo flow to try out that send rich email action. So here it is, send rich email. Okay, so we'll add that, and you can see here's our huge list of stuff. Send rich email. So let's keep this simple. I'm going to turn on send to this one email address, and I'm going to use one of my test email inboxes, Alex Salesforce demo, and let's set the subject to this is the first test of the walkthrough video. And we got a body somewhere here. Body, body, body. Okay, here's a body. And we're just going to keep this simple and say this is the body. So let's hook that up. Click Save. And now I'm going to run it, and as I usually do when I'm developing, I'm going to run it in the debugger. And it looks like it was successful, so let's log in. And here it is. So our send rich email action is working up on our scratch org. Okay, so now let's start building our custom property editor. Okay, custom property editors are Lightning Web components, so the first thing we have to do is create one. And I, as a convention, am simply going to use the name of the underlying action, send rich email, and then just put CPE here. You can use a different convention, but I like making that relationship clear. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go and grab the CPE JavaScript template. which contains a lot of useful little bits and pieces that will make this faster. So get the latest version of this from the documentation, or look for custom property editors on the pilot site, or grab it at custom property editors information on unofficial SF. So let's grab that and let's replace this with that template. All right. So far so good. Now if we look down here, we can see that we don't have anything in the HTML section. We've got a bunch of JavaScript, and we'll go look at that JavaScript. But to get started, why don't we just put something here? I'm the new custom property editor for send rich email. And now the small but crucial linkage that registers this Lightning Web Component that we've just created with the send rich email invocable action. Okay, so I'm going to create the registration by simply pasting in this configuration editor attribute into the invocable method. Supported in Spring 20 and thereafter. This is the standard syntax for referring to a Lightning Web Component. Be careful with the capitalization. Notice that this is lowercase, even though we used uppercase here. And so now let's push that. And now let's go back to our actual flow. So we're going to go back to our Scratch org, CPE Walk 1. Which, if for any reason, if we've taken a while, if we've lost it, we can always go and open it again from VS Code. And now, when we open this up, we get an error message. Aha, why do we get this error message? Well, it's because at least at the time that I'm recording this is in pilot. So this error message means the org is not enabled for the current custom property editor pilot. So take the steps that you need to enable your org. Basically, open a support case. Provide the ID of your org. That's available in company information. So I will go now and be right back when I've enabled this org. Okay, so I'm back and I've enabled this org. So let's refresh. And we're in business. We have our new custom property editor. All right, onward. Okay, so one of the sort of core benefits of a custom property editor is that it gives you complete control over how to organize all of the UI that your action needs to present. And you do that in the HTML section. So we're back here on the HTML part of our custom property editor. And we'll come back to the JavaScript, but for now, let's just add some HTML. Let's have some fun with the power of HTML. So when I went back and I looked at all of those attributes for send rich email, it felt to me like the best organizing paradigm was to put them in three buckets. One was sender information like reply email and display name of the sender. Then the second was all of the addressee information, your to, your CC, and your BCC. And the third section was your subject and your body. So I'm going to start by actually creating sections using basically some plain HTML. I'm going to paste in here this, and you can see here that it's going to say set sender settings, and I've got some SLDS classes in here that make it very easy for me to get a nice consistent look and feel, but I also have some pure CSS style information here to specify exactly the color that I want. So let's create our 3 sections here, and then we'll call this one set addresses, and we'll call this one set subject and body, and put sender stuff here. So we're going to put, these are just placeholders, we're going to fill in more stuff, but for now we'll just do this, put addressee stuff here and put subject and body stuff here. So let's push this up. So I haven't done anything with the JavaScript, nothing clever, just adding some static HTML, and now let's see the impact of that. So you can see that the custom property editor is rendering all of that and giving me a nice organizational capability. And one thing I'll just mention in passing here, it doesn't take long for you to go, wow, a lot of this real estate here, this big rectangle of stuff is sort of outside of my reach. And we are actually working on that for summer 20. We're going to sort of tighten this up into a really nice one-line version of this to give you more real estate to work with. So plenty of polish yet to come. Okay, so now I think it's time to actually start playing with the JavaScript heart of the custom property editor. So let's go and take a look at the template that we are going to start with. So the imports are very standard, nothing special here. And I've got my name right here. Now the first thing we have here is a settings object. This is a total optional convention that I'm using here just to create one place for storing values like component width, and these values of course can easily be modified to be dynamically specified. So the ones that I've got here are sort of general to all CPEs, but as you're going to see, we're going to add some in that are useful for this particular email scenario. Okay, so then the next thing is input values. When inputs come in, I store them here in this object, and that allows me to use some general purpose input processing right here without worrying about the specifics, sort of a bit of a separation of concerns, and we'll see that in a few minutes. The next section, quite important, is flow context. So flow context is essentially the upstream merge fields that you want to make available to the person configuring your action so that they can map in value from upstream. So in a normal flow, it looks like this. And you click on one of the combo boxes, you see all of these upstream pieces of possible mergeable data. So this list is very important. If you kind of think about it, it's kind of the heart of configuring an action. The basic property editor is just one after another of these pick lists where you can map in upstream merge field information. So we need to do the same thing in our CPE. And that's done by using the data passed to us in the flow context property. So the flow context is going to come in. This setter is going to come in. I'm going to set it into this local variable, and I've got some console logs. You'll see that useful in a few minutes when we want to take a look and see the data coming in. keep in mind a couple things to keep in mind about flow context. Even though there's a setter here, you never want to change this. This is information that Flow Builder manages. It may update it from time to time, and we want to parse it, and we'll talk about how to parse it and some of the utilities for parsing it in a minute. So the next important property is values. Flow Builder also passes you this, and this represents the actual values that are currently assigned to the inputs of your underlying action. So as you expose UI and as users interact with your UI, you will take the things they're typing in and selecting. You will dispatch that information up to Flow Builder, and Flow Builder will update its representation of those values. And when you click the Save button in Flow Builder, it will save those values into the Flow XML so that they are available when someone runs the flow. So when you initialize your CPE, of course, some of the time you are editing an existing action, and it's already got some values. So those values are going to come in, and you need to make sure that you take the values that are coming in and you load your various components. You do your various processing. So what our template does here is anytime it gets an updated set of values from Flow Builder, it calls this initialize values function, which is right here. And one of the first things that initialize values does is it parses the values coming in and it puts them in this little input values data structure. That was this data structure right here. And then there's a placeholder space here for doing additional mapping and setting of your controls and your components. And the more complex your UI is, the more work you're going to have to do here. And then we set is initialized to true, and the HTML is going to make use of this is initialized flag. So let's keep moving. The next thing here is something that you shouldn't actually have to touch at all. This is the main event dispatcher that notifies Flow Builder every time your user changes the value of something. So what you need to make sure is that in your HTML, when the user clicks on a checkbox or pulls down a pick list, you need to make sure that this function gets called so that this dispatch event passes a value changed event up to Flow Builder. And that is how this values data is kept in sync. Remember that Flow Builder is not going to ever automatically get notified when something happens inside your custom property editor, because that's just not how LWC rolls. Okay, we've got another utility function that sort of sits above the dispatch flow value change event. So actually what you're going to see is that my HTML is going to call this handle flow value change. It does some processing, and then it calls dispatch flow value chain event. So I've sort of wrapped this base dispatch flow value change event with a little pre-processing that essentially extracts the event information and automatically makes sure that the proper payload is set up for Flow Builder. So these essentially will automatically handle almost all of the change activity. We keep going down. I've got a small utility function here, input style. The only thing that this is doing right now is it will, if you have set the component width in settings, so that's back up here, if you have a value here, then what this utility function does is it returns essentially the style syntax that a component would expect. So we're going to see this in the HTML as well. And it might not be worth doing a utility function just for one thing, but you can stick other pieces of style information in here and then apply it all at the same time for every one of your HTML components. The final piece here is the validate function. This is going to get called when the user clicks save in Flow Builder, and it will give your component a chance to check its state, make sure that the values that Flow Builder has are accurate and valid, and if necessary, you can pass back errors and stop the save from happening and return error messages. Okay, let's start enhancing our custom property editor. Okay, so we have several sender related text values that need to be set, and let's add those to the HTML. Okay, so I will add these here. So what do we have here? That if the isInitialized value is true, then we should add a div in the style of input style, and we have three of this component, which is called Flow Combo Box. Flow Combo Box is a utility that is available, an open source component that's available. It's essentially the standard LWC base combo box wrapped with some flow awareness. So the most valuable thing Flow Combo Box is good at is that you can take that flow context that I was just talking about, that big complex data structure that comes down from Flow, and you can simply pass it to Flow Combo Box and it will handle the formatting and ordering of it into a pick list. And so let's take a look at that. Now, so what else do these combo boxes do? Well, they've got a name and a label. Their value is taken from reply email address in the input values data structure. So why don't we go and put that in there, because as you may recall, that's empty right now. So I am going to put in all of the input values that I'm going to need. These all map to individual input attributes on my action. So let's push this. Okay, so let's take a look, and now you can see the three combo boxes, and if I click on the combo box, you can see that the flow context is being automatically handled in here. Now, one thing to notice is the only thing we're seeing here are strings, and that's what we want. We want to be, because a reply email address is a string. There's a lot of other things here that didn't get shown here. For example, there are many record collection variables, and none of those are visible here. And notice that when I reopened this, the values were still there. And that may seem obvious, but the reason that's happening is because when I add values here, each time I add values, it is doing that whole dispatch of events loop. And in fact, we can take a look at this. And you may recall I mentioned how we have a console log. So every time we open this, it's passing the flow context. Now, there is a lot of flow context in this particular flow, but the part we care about is actually right down here at the end. It's the action call that's called send rich email. So it's this action. So this is Flow's data representation of it. And you can see that, for example, the get leads merge field is properly stored here in the reply email address input attribute. And if we take this out and let's put my string in place and we say done, you can see that because we dispatch an event, now Flow Builder's internal representation of all of the context that's available has this. And if we were to look in the console at the values field that Flow Builder is sending down, it would also show that it was tracking that value. So that was a bit of a digression. I mentioned that it was noteworthy that when you open this up, you only see strings. You may have noticed that there is something here called a flow context filter type. So I have this set to string. So this is basically telling Flow Combo Box filter everything else out that's not type string. So this is quite useful for limiting what shows up in your combo box. All right, so to review where we're at, we have added some Flow Combo boxes to our custom property editor, and because the changes to those components are getting passed to an event dispatcher that's notifying Flow Builder, Flow Builder is storing the values that the user is entering here just as a base property editor for an action would do. So when the flow is saved and run, it will use the right inputs, it will grab this field, it will do the right replacement, it will dynamically fill in the right value, and everything will be great. So let's move on to a little more of a complex example. To handle addresses, we built a custom address accordion component. So now we're focusing on the addressee stuff. So I'm going to replace this with my HTML. So I won't go into great detail on this particular block of HTML, but I will draw attention to this data structure. Essentially, available recipients is what represents the two BCC and CC blocks of recipients. So we have a corresponding data structure to add to the JavaScript side. So my available recipients structure looks like this. It's basically an array that contains a to object, a CC object, and a BCC object. And what this really serves to do is act as a bridge between the UI that I'm going to show in my custom property editor and these attributes of the invocable action. So in the previous example, we had one-to-one relationships where we had one flow combo box and it was setting one invocable action input parameter. Here we have a more complex example where we have 15 different invocable action attributes, and you may remember from earlier when I was showing the sort of usability problems of the standard property editor. One of the problems was there's just too many of these that have to be selected, but what we're going to do is we're going to sort of manage all 15 of these attributes with one nice little piece of UI. So although the previous examples were simple and available recipients is complex, the two tasks I have are the same. I have to make sure that at initialization time that I pull information from all of these attributes. In this case, I have to look at 15 different attributes and then properly initialize the UI that I'm showing. And then every time the user changes something in my UI, I go the other direction. I have to make sure that I dispatch the appropriate event, marking the appropriate one of those 15 back to Flow Builder. So I need to enhance my initialization function to handle this situation. So I'm not going to go into great detail on this because most of this code is specific to email addressing and isn't really the focus of this tutorial. I'm calling a function here called set available recipients values, and I'm calling a function initialize body options. So I'm just going to add those in here, and you can see that essentially there are two variables, available recipients and body options. Let's make sure I have those. defined. I've got available recipients here, but I think I might need to add body options to my template. So here's some of the additional variables that I need. And it turns out that I need to do some additional processing when the flow context comes in to basically parse the flow context into forms that my existing components know how to deal with. So I've got calls out to these two functions. So let's add those two functions in. And we'll stop there on the detail because the rest of the building of this component is sort of more of the same and mostly specific to email. So that's a good introduction. The final code for the send rich email custom property editor is available. It's for examination, and you are very much encouraged to build custom property editors. If you need an action to build a custom property editor for, then you may want to take a look at the actions that are available in the Lightning Flow Components repository. Until next time.